My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. And those of y'all who've listened to the podcast for the past couple of years know that this podcast, the last podcast we do in the year, is a little bit different from the normal podcast. Normally, I talk about a particular text. We go over the text, why it works as a literary work, and what it reveals about this place that we call China. This is the end of the year podcast where I talk about life and the podcast more generally. It's sort of a meta podcast, much more chatty than my usual podcast, very free flowing. I don't want to say Zhuangzian because I think Zhuangzi might not. I don't know how Zhuangzi would feel about this podcast, this particular format that I do. Maybe it's okay to call it Zhuangzian. Whatever. This year has been a very eventful year in my life and the life of the podcast. At the very end of last year, I was in talks with publishers, Amy and Don there at Unsung Voices Books. I mentioned this on the 2023 End of the Year podcast. I've signed a contract with good folks at Unsung Voices Books. We signed that contract in January or February 2024 while I was working as an adjunct professor at the University of Oregon. In our discussions, they were first hoping to get the book to them in a something like a complete format by June 2024. And I was like, I really need the summer to write. And they, in our contract, very kindly set the date for August 31st as the deadline for the manuscript, but they made sure that it was clear they could be a bit flexible on that date, which is very good because I did not make that deadline at all. I was not even close. I'm recording this podcast in mid-December, and I just turned in a draft of all 4 sections of the book in early December, and I turned in an introduction to them just about 5 or 6 days ago. Still trying to figure out whether I need to write an actual conclusion. I'm going to talk to my long-suffering editors about the concluding chapter and whether or not the book actually needs it or if we can just kind of leave it there. My thoughts on this whole process, it turns out writing a book, if you want to do it well, it's really, really hard work. I know a lot about Chinese literature and Chinese history, and yet I still had to do a fairly large amount of reading on each of these topics just because there's so much evidentiary precision that writing a book requires. When you're saying it for eternity, this book, it's going to exist past when I die. That's the thing that books do. They go on. They live a life that's separate from the author and almost always beyond the author's own life. So you really want to get it right if it's, I don't want to say for eternity, but for a really long time. If this is going to be my tombstone, I want to know really precisely that I got it right. To do this, the amount that I needed to know, the amount of precision that I actually needed was very intense. I needed to know exactly what happened, when it happened, who wrote it, why they wrote it, what my source was. It was just so intense. It's way more intense than writing a PhD dissertation. The dissertation is quite different. With a PhD dissertation, you have 4 really smart people. That is your dissertation committee. They're breathing down your necks, and they have a lot to say about whether or not what you say is right. Of course, they come with their own biases, and they bring their biases to your own work. But the cool thing about the dissertation process is you have 4 amazing fact checkers. And although dealing with the axes that they want to grind with your work is not all that fun, when your committee okays something, they are not going to allow you to say anything that is stupidly wrong. The process of writing a book for a general audience is completely different. My editors have not fact-checked me all that much. I'm sure they're going to do some of it, but I don't think they're going to do too much. My editors expect me to bring the expertise. Their expertise is in terms of writing and the publishing process. One of my editors, Don Russo, is someone who knows quite a bit about China and Asia more generally, but his expertise is in publishing. For me, that's insanely intimidating. Even when I write for The Economist, and for those of y'all who don't know, I was an intern at The Economist in London in 2016. They flew me out to England, put me out, and they made me write some articles about China and Asia, and it was amazing. So much fun. Such a great newspaper. I still get to write for them occasionally. I think I mentioned in the podcast that I published a piece this summer Actually, it was on Kung Fu in Africa. I can put a link to that in the podcast page. I actually submitted the piece to the Middle East and Africa section of The Economist in early October 2023, but as I'm sure some of y'all are probably aware, there was a lot of news coming out of that region at that time, and so it just kind of did not get published until this past summer of 2024. The reason I bring that up is because The Economist fact checks everything. So if I screw something up big, it doesn't go public. It gets fixed. I think most reputable newspapers do fact check fairly well. But with a book, I'm the expert. I'm expected to do my own fact checking, to double and triple check. I would never put anything out there that I knew was false, but there was just a lot of information to tackle. I'm writing a book on a ton of different things. I do a ton of translations from both classical and modern Chinese, lots of classical, and my editors don't read classical Chinese. I'm not that great at classical Chinese. It's something that I'm learning. Actually, I'm hoping to do a podcast next year on how I use ChatGPT to help me with my translations and to help speed up the translation process. So it just takes a lot of time to write a book. I loved the writing process. I felt like I learned so much. But by the end of December, I was just like, I want to get this book done. Let me just send it into my editors. I'm getting tired of looking at this, reading it, rereading it, going back to my notes on different things. I honestly got sick of the book, which is where I'm supposed to get if I'm doing a good job. If you're not getting so deep into the material that you eventually get sick of it, then you're probably doing something wrong. At least that's my understanding. Now that I've turned it in, I'm starting to step back. Again, I only turned in the introduction 5 or 6 days ago, but I'm starting to step back and be able to enjoy going back into the book and thinking about those topics and what my contributions to the thinking about those topics are. I mean, the book hasn't come out yet, so I guess I really haven't contributed that much. But once it comes out, how those contributions will play out in the U.S. book reader market, but also in the wider English reading world. As I mentioned before on earlier episodes of this podcast, and I think I alluded to it already on this podcast, this year I was not just writing, but until June of 2024, I was also gainfully employed teaching as an adjunct professor at the University of Oregon's East Asian Languages and Literatures department, where I got my PhD from back in 2021. I started teaching there at the beginning of 2023. I talked a bit about that in last year's end of the year podcast. I'm going to talk a bit about that here. When I was first offered the job at the UO, my first instinct was to turn it down. I know that sounds crazy, but my thinking was I was done with academia. I didn't want to get involved in it again, but I waited to send the no email and I thought through it and I realized what an awesome opportunity it would be to get to teach, to get to call myself and have others call me a professor. So teaching is something that I really enjoy doing. The intellectual feedback I get from teaching students is really invigorating. The kind of respect you get from being a professor it's really cool. People look at me differently. As a professor, it's very different from being a TA. That is, my previous position was as a grad student who's a teaching assistant, the sort of factotums who accompany the professor and teach some classes. When I was a teaching assistant, I was only in charge of a very small group of people. So from 2014 to 2016, I was a teaching assistant in first year Mandarin classes at the University of Oregon. I had 2 classes, 25 students in total. I taught each class 2 hours a week, so a total of 4 hours a week of teaching. The professor in charge of the class, technically, she was called the instructor of record. She determined the curriculum. I came up with stuff to practice whatever she was teaching that week. It was a pretty chill job. I gave grades, but the instructor of record was always able to, and frequently did, override my grades, which is how it's supposed to work. A similar thing happened with teaching Chinese literature and film classes. I had 2 classes. Each class had 25 students, so I had a total of 50 students normally. I taught only for an hour a week on Fridays. It was always Fridays. That's the way my department does it. 2 hours of teaching a week on Fridays, but I also had to attend the lectures by the instructor of record. Again, that instructor of record had a lot more power than me. My power was really limited to what happened on Fridays. I could do, within reason, I could do whatever I wanted. I had to generate discussion around whatever text or film that the instructor of record had assigned. I didn't really give grades. I suggested participation grades to the professor, and she would frequently override me, as, like I said, is supposed to be the case. So I didn't really have all that much power as a teaching assistant doing teaching. I taught some, and I thought of myself as a teacher, but looking back on it after having been a professor for a year, a lot of the aspects of teaching that make teaching so special and so burdensome, I just didn't have. I didn't have to worry about whether or not my grade was going to affect a student's future because I didn't give real grades. I gave grades that were more of suggestions. I passed those on to the professor above me, and they would be the ones who determined what the final grade was. As a professor from September 2023 to June 2024, I had a lot of power. I could fail students. I did fail students. As we say in Chinese, 我说的算. I had all the power. And it was really burdensome. The students who I did have to fail, I really had no choice but to fail them, even though I really didn't want to. Some students just didn't show up to class. They just didn't appear. I had no record of one of them ever appearing in my class, and one of them showed up for 2 or 3 weeks and then just disappeared. Even if I wanted to pass them, it wouldn't be fair to the other students to pass those. But it was a burden that I carried with me. And I'm going to tell you a story about how I learned about power and what a professor does and what a professor can do with that power. So I'm going to tell you all the story of Mrs. Fields. Mrs. Fields was a student of mine. Of course, that's not her real name, but I'm going to use it as a pseudonym just to make the storytelling a lot easier. So Miss Fields was in my first class that I taught as a professor. It was a Chinese film class. I taught it in the fall quarter of 2023. For the first 4 weeks of the class, Miss Fields, she didn't participate much in my lecture. She wore this I don't give a flip about this class hoodie, always sank low in her chair. She wasn't really any worse than the average student, but she and her boyfriend did always sit up in the front, a couple of rows of class. I was teaching in this kind of stadium lecture classroom, and she and her boyfriend normally sat in the second row. And so I always noticed them because most of the students who don't give a flip about that class, they would usually sit in the back. I didn't think that much of it. I had 100 students in this lecture. I'm drowning in new responsibilities as an adjunct professor. I have no ability to deal with how individual students are kind of making their way through my class and how they're thinking about my class unless something really, really bad or really good comes to my attention. So I've got Mrs. Fields. She is just an average student. Anyways, around the time of the midterm, we watched a film called The Touch of Sin. It's a 2013 film. It's really good, really fascinating film. I'm actually thinking about doing a podcast on it, on those occasional podcasts where I do talk about films. But for today's podcast, all you really need to know about the film is that towards the end of the film, there are 2 very sexual scenes in the film. One where a woman is working in a whorehouse, not as a prostitute, but as a non-sex worker who just kind of makes the prostitution go along. So she, is some other worker in this whorehouse. And 2 men attempt to rape this woman, and she murders them in a very bloody way. In another scene that follows this murder, the film focuses on the story of a different woman who is working as a prostitute in a different whorehouse. And the film shows quite a bit of her sex work. Although this film sounds very risque, it's actually one of the most important films to come out of China in the 2010s. In fact, I would say it is the most important film of that decade. Touch of Sin comes out in 2013, right as Xi Jinping is taking power. And the film implicitly criticizes the CCP. It criticizes the CCP for allowing China to become a society where money rules, where there is no morality. After 2013, no film like this can come out. No artistic film that deals with China's problems in such a gritty way has been produced since then, as far as I know, just because Xi Jinping has closed off avenues for criticizing the CCP, particularly on the silver screen. In other words, A Touch of Sin is a really important film. I put it on the syllabus without thinking anything of it, despite the sexual nature of some of the scenes in the film. Of course, my thinking was it had to be on there. I was a TA for this particular course in 2017, 2018, and 2019. That film was always on the syllabus. We had no issues with it. So I asked students to watch A Touch of Sin, and right before the lecture on A Touch of Sin, Miss Field actually comes up to me and she says this to me as I'm kind of setting up on stage and getting the computer and the quiz ready. She says she didn't watch the film because of the sexual violence in it. And I was kind of like, okay. I noted that in my mind. I didn't know what to do about it. It wasn't a huge deal. She didn't tell me exactly what happened, but it later became clear to me that she read a description of the film online and decided not to watch any of it. At first, I assumed she had watched some of it and then just stopped watching when it got to the very sexual parts in the later half of the film. But it became clear to me a week or two later that that's not what happened. So I was preparing the midterm. This is the middle of the quarter, and I just happened to use a scene from that film, The Touch of Sin. It's a scene from the very beginning. It's not one of the scenes that has very sexualized violence. It's kind of a boring scene, but it's a scene with lots of juicy symbolism. I thought that it would be easy for students to analyze. Anyways, Miss Field turns in her exam, and the section for a film scene analysis is just completely blank. She just gives it to me and says she hadn't watched the film, so she couldn't do the analysis. And at first, I thought about giving her a 0 for that portion of the exam. She didn't do the work. I assumed that she had, watched at least some of the film. She hadn't. And so I was like, well, a 0 is kind of what you get. But as I thought about that, as I took the midterms back and started to grade them and work with my TAs who were under me, and we started to grade them, I realized how stupid my thinking was. My goal as a teacher is to get my students to learn something, to master both the history of China, even if it's in a very basic form. I want them to leave understanding the history of the place we're studying. And I want students to understand how to analyze these different texts, whether those be films or songs or books. Whatever text I'm asking them to study, I want them to understand how to analyze it and to understand whatever we choose. So there are really 3 things that I'm trying to teach students. I want them to understand the context that produced those texts. I want them to understand the text that I assigned. And I want them to understand how to read a film scene, how to read a poem, how to read anything. And although she had not watched that particular film, she hadn't failed to do that other stuff that I asked for a student. And so it would be completely stupid for me to give her a 0 as a grade. My goal was to test her on the amount of work that she had put in, and the amount of knowledge that she had gained. And because this particular question was about A Touch of Sin, her answer didn't reflect the amount of knowledge and the amount of work that she had put in. Even if she was coming every day in those I don't give a flip hoodies and just lounging in her chair, I needed to do a better job to see if she had actually done the work, if she had watched other film. It was incumbent, even if she did not seem like a good student in this 100-person class, how do I know who the good students are? I mean, there are some students who I know who are really quite good, but then there were other students who were just really quiet. And I had no idea whether they were just zoning out or whether they were intensely paying attention to the text that I was assigning them and learning things really well. It was incumbent upon me to give Mrs. Fields a chance. So I called Mrs. Fields into my office and we talked. I let her do that half of the exam on a different scene from a completely different film. I didn't tell her which one it was going to be because, of course, that would not be fair to the other students. She did really well on that makeup portion of the exam. And the reason I did that was because I came to realize how utterly dumb giving her a 0 would have been. And I did it because allowing her to do that makeup exam, not every professor, I talked to some professors to get advice on this, and not every professor would have allowed her to do it. But I came to realize that it was the right thing to do, and that's why I did it. When I did it, I was not thinking about some broader pedagogical plan to turn her into a good student. But something unexpected happened after I allowed her to make up the exam. Mrs. Fields went from being a not particularly involved student to being one of my best students. She was constantly answering questions in class. the quality of her participation was really high. She got really good, and she became one of the best students of the class. She actually wore that hoodie a lot less frequently, and she sat up and paid attention in lectures. Like there was a physical change in how she participated in class. She became one of the best students I taught all year. She not only did really well in that fall quarters class, she actually asked me about my winter quarter class, Chinese popular culture, and she was like, I'm going to take that since you're teaching it. She actually made her boyfriend take it as well. And in that class, she was actually one of my best students again. And she was thinking about taking my class in the spring, but there was some bureaucratic reason that she could not take it. The lesson that I learned from this whole thing is I thought of teaching as the teacher imparting knowledge to the student. There's an important emotional component to teaching that's often ignored. It's possible for students to learn from a teacher they think doesn't give a hoot about them. But it's a lot harder to learn if you think your teacher doesn't care about you. For students, it's much, much easier when you think a teacher doesn't care about you to just put up this emotional wall, to wear that I don't give a flip about you hoodie, to sink low in that chair. But if you as a teacher show that you care about the students, a lot of times teachers can break through and get to students and change them. Teachers can make students into better students. And one of the ways you can do that, sometimes, not all the time, it doesn't always work, but some of the times you can do that by being something other than a jerk, by just being a nice teacher. And that was one of the big lessons I took away from teaching this year. I was talking about the case of Miss Fields to one of my mentors, Marm Epstein. She came in and watched one of my classes. It's just something that the department does. Everybody gets someone coming into their class every year, and you get observed. We were talking about the case of Miss Fields, and, we talked about Gen Z. We debated how much what I had experienced with Miss Fields was related to the sense that Gen Z is a little bit too precious. This is something that's often discussed in the US. I don't know how true it is outside the US. And I'm not saying I do or don't believe that Gen Zers are the word usually used in American discourse as snowflakes. I'm not saying I do or don't believe that. When Professor Epstein and I were discussing Miss Fields, we were discussing her in those terms and how one has to manage the classroom with this generation. And she said that, I should think more carefully about assigning this film and other films with sexual violence for Gen Z students. But the real lesson I came away with is that one that I just mentioned, that to give a hoot about your students, that is actually the main thing. I kind of think that if I were invited to teach this class again at the UO, I would still show a touch of sin. I would not concern myself with the sexual violence in this film, but I would make sure that if another issue like this came up, I would be very attentive to students' emotional needs. It's not as important to show or not show Gen Z students things like this. That's actually a smaller part of this debate. What is important is that I needed to show my students that, okay, I hear you. This is upsetting. Sure, you didn't follow the syllabus, but I get that this is really important to you, that this is something that you value, that you do not want to watch these kinds of scenes. Even if the film is the most important film of that decade, you really don't think you can make it through that. If you're willing to demonstrate that you can do the work, if you're willing to try and learn, then I'm going to go the extra mile to make you feel okay about who you are and about the experiences that you bring to this classroom. I don't know what happened with Miss Fields and why that particular scene was so upsetting to her. I do know that other female students who I talked with indicated to me that there were actually several girls who had not watched the film or who were troubled by that film. So listening turned out to be a very important skill that I got as a teacher. And when I came into teaching as a professor, I thought that it was much more me talk, they listen. But it turned out to be, although I talked a heck of a lot, I had talked a ton in those lectures. But one of the most important skills that I got from teaching was being a better listener and thinking about how to listen to students whose grade I hold in my hand. I could have given her a 0 for that portion of the exams. One of the most important things I learned is that by listening, I actually gained much more insight into my students. And I could, just by listening to them and taking their concerns seriously, make them into better students. my actions made Miss Fields a better student. She left my classroom more equipped to read, to analyze, to think, to be a thought leader on China in the 21st century. She was much more receptive to learning after I did that for her. And I'm forever grateful for the lessons that I learned as a professor. Is one of the best things that I took away from my year as an adjunct professor. And I think that's a good place to end this final podcast of the year. Next year, my first podcast is going to be with Joel Bigman. He's the author of The Second Journey, a novel he recently published with Earnshaw Publishing. And The Second Journey is a cool continuation novel of the journey to the West, but this time it gets a Jewish twist. Tang Monk goes all the way to the Middle East, and I'm going to leave you with that and not tell you much more. And you'll just have to come back for the interview with Joel. Speaking of books and publishing, if you're interested in my forthcoming book, make sure to go to my website, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. Click on the button that says pre-order my book. With this, you are not pre-ordering it. You're just putting your name on an email list to get some updates about the book, when it comes out, that sort of thing. Probably going to come out sometime in the middle of 2025. We'll see. Hopefully, my delaying things has not messed up my publisher's schedules too much, but I will definitely keep you updated as the book comes closer to publication. I'll mention on the podcast, probably to the point where you're sick and tired of it. That's called marketing. Speaking of next year, let's look at today's final phrase. I don't think it technically qualifies as a Chengyu because Chengyu are almost always 4zi, 4 Han Chinese characters, 4 kanji phrases that have a story behind them. And this is actually 2 4-character phrases, and I don't think there's any story behind it. As far as when I was searching around for things, I couldn't find any story. But I think it's a good phrase to know because it's a nice phrase to say at the end of the solar new year, the end of the Western calendar. So as December gives way to January, not the Chinese New Year. 岁末将至 Jing Song Dong Sui. This phrase can be used as a greeting around the new year in China. It literally means something like, the end of the year is about to come. I respectfully wish you a peaceful winter. That phrase again is 岁末将至 Jing Song Dong Sui. That's about it for me. The end of the year has come, and I'm going to respectfully wish you, my podcast listener, a very peaceful winter. My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.